Welcome to my thesis for one of the greatest films ever made, David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia. This is a film with powerful universal themes such as fate versus free will, the desire to live an extraordinary life versus an ordinary life, themes pertaining to duality, and whether irony is just a coincidence or is it something more? Is it God? Is it destiny? These are the themes that attract me to this film. And David Lean's direction is impeccable. I've never seen anything like it. So please join me on this journey as I explore the themes of Lawrence of Arabia and what the film means to me.
Lawrence of Arabia was released on December 10th, 1962, produced by Horizon Pictures and distributed by Columbia Pictures. It is based off the main characters T.E. Lawrence's 1926 book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and directed by David Lean, winner of 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. And as much as David Lean is revered within the film community, among contemporary audiences, in my opinion, it appears he is not as well known. Young audiences and contemporary audiences are familiar with directors such as Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, and even someone like Alfred Hitchcock, but you never really hear young audiences or contemporary audiences speak of David Lean. So as much as David Lean is revered within the film community, the film connoisseurs, I feel like he's a little bit underrated with the general audiences of today, which is kind of sad to me because I feel like he is a masterful director and he is one of my favorite directors of all time. And some of the other movies that I really love by him are The Bridge on the River Kwai, Oliver Twist, Passage to India, Great Expectations, and Dr. Zhivago. Now, the character of T.E. Lawrence is an iconic and almost mythological character among British history. And he is not without controversy, especially since he's passed away. There are some historians that have accused T.E. Lawrence of exaggerating his achievements, and some have called him an outright liar. And the film actually addresses this. And this is one of the reasons why I adore this film, because one of the central themes of this film is the theme of legend versus the actual person. And we get to see how T.E. Lawrence actually struggles with these notions of being this legendary figure and him striving to be an ordinary person and him resisting his own legend. Now, what makes T.E. Lawrence such a renowned figure in British history is his leadership role in the Arab Revolt and the Sinai and Palestine campaign against the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. He was able to facilitate cooperation and communication among Arab tribes in order to fight in unison, and he also advocated the Arab kingdom of Hijaz's war for independence against the Ottoman Empire. And what we see essentially in this film is T.E. Lawrence's transformation, the transformation that he undertook in his fight against the Turks in World War I. Now, the film opens up showing us the death of T.E. Lawrence. So basically, he dies in a motorcycle accident. And it shows him speeding in his motorcycle, and he tries to get out of the way of oncoming traffic, and this is what causes his death. I think the reason why T.E. Lawrence was speeding so much in this opening sequence and what this scene was trying to convey was that he was trying to replicate the thrills that he had, that feeling that he had when he was in the desert with the Arabic tribes. fighting against the Turks, trying to replicate that feeling. Because what happens is Lawrence falls in love with the desert. He falls in love with the Arabic people. And I think going back to British society, he just never could fit in again. So in this sequence, him speeding and him having that look on his face like he's thrilled, it's him trying to replicate those thrills that he experienced in the desert, which ultimately led to his death. And this leads us to another central theme in the film, which is the theme of irony. And the reason why this is ironic is because there is a scene in the film later on where a main character, an Arabic character, tells Lawrence, there is only the desert for you. And later in the film, Lawrence struggles with, again, being integrated back into British society. So for him to die in that manner, trying to replicate those thrills of being in the desert, it kind of ties in with what that character, and the character was played by Anthony Quinn, what Anthony Quinn's character says to him, there was only the desert for you. So Lawrence essentially could never really be integrated back into British society because there was only the desert for him. And the irony here is him trying to basically almost like replicate the thrills, almost like a kid play fighting or pretending with playfulness that he's in the desert, and him dying in that manner. It was like he should have never left the desert in the first place because he was not the same person. He had transformed. He was no longer British, essentially. He became part of the tribe, and he should have never left the desert. This is why this scene, this death, is ironic. And there's lots of ironic moments in this movie, and we are going to address them. Now, another central theme, as I previously stated, that this film has is the legend versus the real man. So the film opens up with many characters that knew Lawrence, that heard of Lawrence, and they're discussing basically the legend of T.E. Lawrence. And who really knew him? That's a question that is circulating among these people at his funeral and at his memorial. So, who really knew him? Was he a poet? Was he a scholar? Was he a warrior? Was he a shameless exhibitionist, which is what the photographer, his main photographer, said about him? And another ironic moment happens when the photographer says this. He says he was a shameless exhibitionist, never seen anything like it. And a man overhears him and it upsets him. And he says, how dare you say those things? And then the photographer says, did you know him? And he says, well, I had the pleasure of shaking his hand. And the ironic thing about this scene, this man that basically got all indignant because the photographer said he was a shameless exhibitionist, which caused him to stand up for Lawrence, to defend Lawrence, and that he shook his hand, that he was a great man. This same guy that says this slapped Lawrence across the face when he felt that Lawrence, but he didn't know it was Lawrence, but that this individual was responsible for the negligence of the Turkish prisoners of war to the point that it was almost a crime against humanity. He slapped Lawrence across the face, but he didn't know it was Lawrence because Lawrence's face was covered. So that's what makes this moment so ironic, because if he had known that that negligence of the Turkish prisoners of war was the responsibility of Lawrence, that Lawrence was responsible for this, would he have stood up for him to the photographer like he did? Probably not. He wouldn't think highly of Lawrence. He wouldn't defend him as some great man, as some awesome legend. And that's the irony right there. And it kind of shows the power of myth, the power of legend, and how they influence the public mind for better or for worse. And this is also applicable to the main character, Lawrence. We see how his own legend influences him and how he struggles with that. How he wants to be an ordinary man, but at the same time can't resist the thrill of being this legend, of being loved, of riding into battle and killing enemy soldiers, and how it makes him feel, and how he basically struggles with this transformation. Now, in the beginning of the film, Lawrence is already an eccentric character. He's a highly educated man, but he is eccentric and he's very odd. And he is chosen to go to the Hijaz on an intelligence gathering mission and to meet with Prince Faisal after his men have been demoralized due to their defeat at Medina at the hands of the Turks. Now, Lawrence's role is to meet with Prince Faisal and work out a plan for repositioning the Arab forces to prevent the Ottoman forces around Medina from threatening Arab positions. Now, once Lawrence arrives in the desert, right away my senses are overwhelmed by the most breathtaking outdoor cinematography that has ever been put on film. The way the desert is depicted in this film, it's like nature has been captured in its living, breathing form. The desert is a living, breathing character in this film. And as I stated in the introduction, it is so overwhelming. The epic shots, the way the cinematography captures the desert, the winds, all the natural occurrences of the deserts, the mirages. Beautiful. It's overwhelming because it is just an onslaught to my senses. Shot after shot after shot after shot. You have to basically take time to digest it all. And every time I come back to this film, I get to rewatch it with renewed eyes because there is an epic shot that I never really paid attention to before because there's so many, and every time I see it, it feels like I'm going back to revisit something, yet simultaneously, I'm also seeing it for the first time. It's a beautiful thing. David Lean is the master of the shot composition. There is no other director that can rival him. He is just a master at shot compositions. And in fact, the only other director that I can even think that can come anywhere near to David Lean's shot compositions is John Ford. Now, I just want to briefly use this opportunity to praise the film score by Maurice Jarre, which is just outstanding. It fits in perfectly with this film, and the themes truly capture the spirit of the desert. I cannot imagine this film without Maurice Jarre's film score. It is just brilliant, it's breathtaking, and it is beautiful, and it deserves infinite praise. Now, continuing with the theme of irony that exists within this film, a significant moment that truly has an impact on Lawrence's journey is when he gives his guide the gun, his pistol. Because what happens later is this guide is ultimately killed because he uses the pistol that Lawrence gave him to try to defend himself against Sharif Ali when they are caught drinking from Ali's well, which is one of the greatest edited sequences in the history of film. I mean, the tension here is just powerful. I love this epic wide shot, this composition where we see Sharif Ali emerging almost like a mirage out of the desert. You could barely see him, and then the camera holds at his slow emergence from the horizon, and we see this character moving slowly and slowly towards Lawrence and his guide as they're drinking from the well, and the tension, the fact that there's no music accompanied to this scene, and it just the way the camera just holds on to this composition and Sharif Ali's slow emergence from the horizon, and you see the heat waves just kind of just obscuring the vision of him emerging from the horizon, and how he just gradually starts to emerge, and you see him clearly. I mean, it's just powerful stuff, man. It was just so suspenseful. There was so much tension. You could hear a pin drop from just the tension and the silence, and the silence that accompanies this scene really contributes to the suspense. I mean, I love the way this scene is edited and the way the shots are composed. Now, back to the moment of irony. The irony is that if Lawrence hadn't given his guide his gun, he would have never been shot, because he would have never had a pistol to pull out against Sharif Ali. And moments like this, ironic moments like this, continually happen to Lawrence throughout the course of the film. And it contributes to this other theme, that is there destiny at work here? Or is there truly free will that exists? Because Lawrence likes to think there's free will. Nothing is written. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. There is no fate. There is no destiny. But then these moments of irony just keep happening. It's like him struggling, fighting against the notion that there is a destiny, that possibly there is a God, or something along those lines. It's real powerful stuff. Now, another important thing that must be noted about this sequence, this scene, is the central reason why Sharif Ali killed Lawrence's guide is because he was drinking from a Harith well. And the Harith are an entirely different Arabic tribe than Lawrence's guide is part of. And this scene illustrates the conflict between Arabic tribes and how they are not getting along with one another. And Lawrence even says this to Sharif Ali. He says that as long as the Arabic tribes fight among one another, they will only be perceived as a silly people. And I just want to say that Omar Sharif, who is an outstanding actor, has a great introduction here. Omar Sharif is underrated, in my opinion. As much praise as the Egyptian actor gets in the world of cinema, he deserves more. That's how great he is. If you haven't checked him out in Dr. Zhivago, I highly recommend you do so, because it's another outstanding performance by Omar Sharif. And I love how his character says that he killed Lawrence's guide because he was nothing. The well is everything. And again, Lawrence reiterates to Sharif Ali that as long as the Arabs fight, they will be a little people. They will be perceived as a silly people. And again, this shows the conflict among the tribes and basically the task that Lawrence has to undertake, which is to unite them in order to fight against the Turks. Now, after this sequence, Lawrence finally is able to catch up with Prince Faisal. And we see right away that the prince's people are not used to the technologies of war during this time, during World War One. And basically, they are getting slaughtered by the Turks because the Turks have artillery, they have warplanes, all that stuff. And the sequence here, when the Turks start to bomb the prince's camp, just the epicness of this sequence, and you just see all the extras that are used to illustrate this battle. It's just awesome. I love it. And it just sucks just to think that if this sequence were to be shot today, they would have CGI extras in the background and all that stuff. It is just so beautiful to know when I see this sequence and other sequences in this film that I'm actually seeing real extras. These are real human beings playing these soldiers playing the members of this tribe that's being attacked. It's a beautiful thing. Now another ironic moment follows this sequence, and the irony is that Sharif Ali turns out to be a member of Prince Faisal's tribe, and this was very surprising to Lawrence. And again, another ironic moment, which represents one of the central themes throughout this film. Now, in this sequence, Lawrence catches up with another British officer that is among Prince Faisal's tribe, and his name is Brighton. And together they discuss the possibility of the British attacking Aqaba with support from the British Navy, and that if the British can supply the prince against the Turks, they can have a possibility of victory. Now, during this moment, Brighton and Lawrence have a differing opinion, and there's a lot of frustration among Brighton. Now, basically, Brighton wants Prince Faisal's men to fall back on Yenbo because the British can't support the prince's men with supply and training. However, Lawrence thinks that Yenbo is too far from Damascus and wants to go to Aqaba. Now, this really makes Prince Faisal interested in Lawrence. Just his bravery and his audacity to disagree with Brighton in front of him. And Prince Faisal is played by the great Alec Guinness, who was a frequent collaborator with David Lean, and you can see some of his outstanding performances in Oliver Twist and The Bridge on the River Kwai. And everybody knows Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars trilogy. He's a brilliant actor, and he does an outstanding job as Prince Faisal. Now, one of the most notable things about Prince Faisal is that he knows British interest in the war differs significantly from Arab interest in the war. Now, Prince Faisal fears that ultimately, after they are victorious against the Turks, after they defeat the Turks, that this will lead to an invasion by the British. He knows this, he fears this, and he's a smart leader because he's not going to let the British basically sweet talk him into following along with their plans. He keeps in mind the interests of the Arabic people. Now, there's some great dialogue that is spoken here where they say, "No man needs nothing." And I thought that was fascinating because there is nothing in the desert, literally. But Lawrence loves the desert. He falls in love with the desert. And earlier on, when he talks about where he comes from, which is Britain, he calls it the land of the fat people. So it makes me feel like Lawrence, who is unhappy with living among the British because there is such an abundance, there's such a comforting lifestyle, that he ultimately is the one that needs quote unquote nothing because he finds liberation in nothing. And this liberation is exemplified by the desert. This is why Lawrence falls in love with the desert, because there is nothing in the desert. And this is contrary to when they say no man needs nothing. Lawrence needs nothing. And there is a brilliant scene where Lawrence basically isolates himself in the desert and he kind of goes through a transformation. You see him struggling. You see him basically putting himself through this turmoil, and it's kind of like him purposely withdrawing into himself, and he's isolating himself from the tribe, and he's letting the desert almost brutalize him. He's letting the desert winds into his face, and he's letting himself become dirty, and he's feeling the desert winds and the heat bearing on him, and he's allowing it to happen because he wants to change, he wants to transform. And ultimately, after this moment of isolation, he decides to go to Aqaba by land, and he convinces the others that it's possible because the Turkish guns face the sea. They do not face the land because they would never basically imagine anyone to cross the desert. So the Turks never have their guns pointed to the desert because they don't think anybody is brave enough to cross the desert. And Lawrence is able to convince Prince Faisal's men to accompany him on this desert trek that is impossible, so to speak. Now, it is during this desert trek that Lawrence basically gains the company of two young servants who say it is the will of Allah to serve Lawrence. And these two servants are going to have a significant role to play later on in the film, especially pertaining to the irony, the theme of irony in this film. Now, during this desert trek, Gassim, one of Prince Faisal's men, drifts and he falls off his horse, and basically Sharif Ali says that we cannot go back for him, to forget about him. He is dead. It is written. And Lawrence basically rejects that notion and decides to go back from him. And he says, nothing is written. And this is blasphemy, especially to Sharif Ali, who calls him an English blasphemer. And again, this is a central theme in this film, this whole notion of whether it is written, whether life has destiny, whether there is fate, whether it is all written, or whether there is free will, with Lawrence saying nothing is written. He is the blasphemer, but he's saying, I am in charge of my own destiny. I am in charge. I can make a difference. And basically, he goes back for Gassim, and he is able to find him and bring him back to the rest of Prince Faisal's men. And this is just an amazing moment for Lawrence, and it's an amazing moment for Prince Faisal's men and Sharif Ali. And this is the beginning of Lawrence's legend, because he starts to do these incredible things because he believes that he is in charge of his own destiny. Nothing is written. Now, after this, Lawrence and Ali have a discussion about their names, the meaning of their names. And Lawrence divulges to Ali that he is a bastard, that his father and mother weren't married, which was very taboo to the Arabic people. Now, it is nice because Ali's response is basically that he can choose his own name. So Lawrence doesn't have the name of his father, but Ali says he can choose his own name, since for him nothing is written, or that he can write his own destiny. After this, Lawrence is given Arabic clothes, and there's some symbolism here with Lawrence burning his old clothes, burning his British uniform, and this is symbolic of the transformation that Lawrence is undergoing. And when he's basically looking at himself through the reflection of his knife, looking at how he looks in the Arabic clothes, this is going to have such a significant impact on Lawrence. This moment with him looking at himself, because even though he went through a transformation, or he's undergoing a transformation, it is not complete yet. He still has innocence. And later on in the film, he uses the same knife to look at his reflection, and he cannot recognize himself. And it's a beautiful, beautiful sense of irony. Again, a central theme in this film. Now, this sequence leads to the introduction of Anthony Quinn's character, and he is upset that Prince Faisal's tribe is drinking from his wells. And again, this echoes the sentiments that were laid out earlier before when Sharif Ali was upset that Lawrence and his guide were drinking from the wells. It illustrates, again, the conflict among the tribes. Now, Lawrence is among the Harith tribe, and Anthony Quinn's character does not like them. Now, Anthony Quinn is an outstanding actor. He's amazing. His character has the best dialogue in the film. It is humorous, it is powerful. I love this character, and Anthony Quinn is an amazing actor. I loved him in Federico Fellini's film La Strada. If you haven't seen that film, check it out. I highly recommend it. Now, Anthony Quinn's character is named Ada, and he is from the tribe known as the Habitat. And in this sequence, Lawrence is able to persuade Ada to be reasonable and allow Prince Faisal's men to drink from his wells and to join the Harith in their battle against the Turks. So in this sequence, we have Lawrence succeeding, being able to unite two tribes that were essentially fighting one another to join forces in order to fight against the Turks. And this sequence where Lawrence convinces Ada to join the Hadith has some great dialogue. It's well written, and there's some real great performances here. So Lawrence, in his attempt to unite the Hawatat with the Hadith, asks Ada if he enjoys basically serving the Turks. So he infers that Ada is a servant to the Turks. And Ada gets very upset at this and indignant, and this causes the character to utter some of the best dialogue in the entire movie. I love how he says, "I'm a river to my people," and humorous dialogue such as, "You trouble me like women." And ultimately, what Lawrence does is he ends up telling Ada that there is an abundance of gold at Aqaba, and this creates the incentive for Ada to join the Harith in their fight against the Turks. Now, on the eve of the Aqaba attack, an incident occurs, and Lawrence has to basically execute a thief that was caught trying to steal from the Hawatat tribe, and ultimately, this led to a murder. And the reason why this thief's life must end, the reason why an execution must occur, is because the conflict between the Hawatat and the Harith is many years old, and there's lots of bad blood there, and that is the only way that they can proceed with their joining of forces against the Turks. If there is no execution, then the Harith and the Hawitat will not fight together against the Turks. So Lawrence is like, okay, I'll do it. I'll be the one to execute the thief, the murderer. And it turns out that the murderer is the man that he went back for to rescue, that was presumed dead when he drifted. So here we have another great example of irony and how irony haunts Lawrence throughout this film. This is the guy that Lawrence went back and basically did the impossible for. The rest of his tribe thought that this man was dead. Lawrence went back and rescued him, showing that nothing is written. However, it turns out that this man commits this crime that is punishable by death. So, this leads some in the tribe to believe that it was better off for him to be left alone in the desert to die that way than to be executed by Lawrence. And this causes some members of the tribe to say it was written. And this haunts Lawrence. This begins this inner struggle in him. Does he control his own destiny, or are things written? Is there such thing as fate? And I love this. And this is the first time that Lawrence commits murder. And we find out later, as he divulges to his superiors in the British Army, that he enjoyed this execution, that he's beginning to enjoy killing. And this is going to further contribute to his transformation. Now, after this, Lawrence, the Hawatat, and the Harith are able to obtain victory at Aqaba, again because the Turkish cannons were pointed at the sea, and Lawrence and the Arabs chose to attack by the desert, which was something that the Turks never expected. So this was how they were able to obtain their victory. And after they obtained this victory, Lawrence starts to be treated almost like a prince. They even say tributes for the prince, garlands for the conqueror. And Lawrence, he replies that he is none of those things. But he does say that he loves this country and this kind of honor that the Arabs are bestowing upon Lawrence begin to create that myth, that legend, the legend of Lawrence of Arabia. And initially, Lawrence is kind of resistant to it at first, But as the film progresses, he begins to believe some of these legendary things about him, and he begins to struggle with being an ordinary man, the desire to be an ordinary man, and him relishing and enjoying this aura of being this legend, this great conqueror. And it's a great conflict within the character. He even goes so far as comparing himself to Moses when he decides to cross the Sinai in order to tell the British at Cairo that they have taken Aqaba. And this is kind of blasphemy to the Arabs, but at the same time, it illustrates how Lawrence is beginning to compare himself to prophets and other great men because he's starting to look at himself in that way. Now, Ada is really upset that there is no gold at Aqaba, despite what Lawrence promised, and Lawrence promises Ada that he will be basically reimbursed for his work and he'll be paid by the British. So when this sequence happens, Ada says of Lawrence that he is not perfect. So you have Lawrence almost like seeing his ego getting inflated. You see his ego getting built up within his own mind because he's starting to believe some of these quote unquote legendary things about himself. He's comparing himself to Moses, but Ada is seeing that he is not perfect, that he is not this prophet. Now, when Lawrence crosses the Sinai, he utters more blasphemy. He says, "Look, a pillar of fire," when he sees a big dust devil out in the middle of the desert. And what that is another reference to Moses when God guided him through the desert when he was leading his men away to be free from the Egyptians. God guided Moses and his people with a pillar of fire. Now, when Lawrence treks through the Sinai, he brings his two young servants with him, and one of them ends up dying when they become trapped in quicksand. Now, Lawrence tries to save him, but he is unable to do so. And this leads to another transformation for Lawrence because he is heartbroken by seeing this young man be killed and feeling helpless, like he cannot help him. So he just went from this moment of basically comparing himself to Moses to this next moment where he is completely and utterly helpless. He is at the mercy of the desert, and the desert takes away his young servant, a life that was so young. And you could see the heartbreak and torment on his face as a result of losing one so young. And again, this is another transformative moment in the film. And as Lawrence and his other young servant who survived trek through the Sinai, Lawrence embraces this transformation. And it almost seems like he embraces it through pain because Lawrence always wants to do things the hard way. And what I'm referring to here is how Lawrence refuses to ride the camel. He would rather walk through the Sinai, and he prefers the harder path. And for me, it's because he comes from a lifestyle of comfort. He comes from Britain. He comes from the land of the fat people, quote unquote. So he's embracing this transformation. He's embracing it through pain. And by the time Lawrence reaches Cairo to speak to his British superiors, he is unrecognizable. All those British officers and the British soldiers cannot recognize him when he first arrives. I mean, because he's dressed like an Arab. He's dressed in the clothes of the Hadith. And he doesn't change his clothes. He stays in the wardrobe of the Hadith. And initially, the British refused his servant, the young boy, entry and drink. And this makes Lawrence very upset. And this allows a great opportunity for Peter O'Toole to exemplify some awesome acting. I really love how he demands lemonade for the young boy. And when he says, "I want a room," and they say to him, "Okay, of course you'll have anything." And he says, "No, it's for him." And he's speaking about his young servant. He demands that his young servant be treated just like he would be treated. And basically, Lawrence meets with his British superiors and he tells them that they've taken Aqaba and they can't believe it. They can't believe that Lawrence was able to achieve this great victory that was almost perceived as impossible to his superiors. And he tells them that there's been a lot of killings and he's a hardened man now. He's changed and you can see it on his face. And O'Toole gives such an epic transformation. It goes against Ali's assumption that he would put the suit on and play English, because that's what Sharif Ali told Lawrence before he departed for Sinai. He said, "Oh, so you're just going to go to Cairo and disregard the Hadith attire and put a suit on and play English, play as one of the British?" And Lawrence didn't do that. Instead, Lawrence comes in dressed in the Hadith wardrobe, face covered in dust and sand, looking like he just basically his soul has been ripped in half, and you just see the transformation. And it's totally contrary to what Ali thought he would be like. And compare this scene with the opening scene, our first initial introduction to Lawrence, where he's basically this eccentric poet. And then look at him here, and you could see he's a completely different person now. And again, Peter O'Toole gives one of the finest performances in cinema right here. Now, what ends up happening is Lawrence is promoted because his superiors are really amazed at what he was able to achieve. But Lawrence doesn't want to be promoted, and he doesn't want to go back, at least initially. And you see in this scene the struggle finally coming to the forefront of the character. He doesn't want to go back, he says that, but then as we get this slow zoom on him, we see the struggle and we see how he describes how he enjoyed killing and how he enjoyed murdering, and he basically recalls the execution that he had to carry out. And he tells them that he enjoyed killing this man and that he's afraid because he enjoyed it. And it looks like his heart is ripping in half. It is such a great performance, and I love how the camera just slowly zooms in on him. And again, we are brought the question, is irony fate or is irony just a coincidence? And I love how this film continually brings this conundrum to the forefront of the movie. Now, I really enjoy the nuances in this scene, especially those coming from Lawrence's superiors. Now, as they discuss what is going to happen to Arabia once the Turks are basically overthrown, you can see in the eyes of the English that they know when the Turks leave that they will move in. The English will move in. The British men even start looking at Lawrence. They're looking at him as if he were a foreigner. And I love the nuances here because it's foreshadowing what is going to happen in the film and in real life history. It is also illustrated in this scene how the British are reluctant to give the Arabs artillery, because they fear that if they give the Arabs artillery, it will give them the incentive to want to be more independent, causing a conflict of interest for the British later on down the line. Now, Lawrence's superiors say of him that he's riding the whirlwind. And Lawrence is kind of naive to this whole notion that the British are going to basically intervene once the Turks are overthrown and take control of the territory that the Turks controlled. Now, after this scene, Lawrence finally agrees to return back to the desert. And at this point, we get to see further transformation of his character. And the scene starts out with Lawrence, basically the reputation that he loves mercy, that he is a giver of mercy. And we can see how this conflicts with the sentiments of the Arabs that he is fighting with. We see this when Lawrence and his men stage an attack against a Turkish train. No one listens to Lawrence's declaration of a ceasefire to stop firing at the Turks. Instead, his men continue to just blast at the Turks mercilessly. And this contradicts with Lawrence's sentiments. This is not what Lawrence wanted. And despite this, Lawrence is shot by a survivor. And another thing about this sequence is that Lawrence doesn't even try to get out of the way of this guy that's shooting at him. It's because he is testing destiny, he is testing fate right here. So when the Turkish soldier shoots Lawrence and he obviously realizes who's shooting at him, he just stands there and lets the soldier continually try to shoot him. And he keeps missing, fortunately for Lawrence. And this right here is Lawrence testing fate. Is it written? It's not written for Lawrence, or so he thinks so in his mind. And he's testing that right here in this scene. And I thought this was really brilliant. And again, this is him believing that he is invincible because he keeps on hearing about his own legend. And as a result of him doing this legend going to Lawrence's head, when another unfortunate, ironic thing happens to him, it's going to be even more devastating to him. It's going to have an even greater significant impact on him and his transformation because he's going to see that things aren't entirely in his hands. He is at the mercy of the universe. And this once again leads to Lawrence buying into his own legend as he says, "Don't you know I can only be killed with a golden bullet?" And this is once again followed up by another low for Lawrence. So this film goes back and forth between highs and lows for the character Lawrence. And after this sequence, Lawrence loses his other servant, another young boy who accidentally blows himself up because of a detonator charge that malfunctioned. And Lawrence has to kill him because his servant was severely injured due to the explosion. And the Turks do not take prisoners of war. In fact, the reputation of the Turks is that they torture prisoners till they die. So Lawrence and his fellow comrades decided best that he kill the young boy because it would be worse to leave him behind to be captured for the Turks. And once again, this is a pivotal moment for Lawrence because he has to do something that is so devastating to his heart, so devastating to his spirit, and it further contributes to his transformation, his hardening, the way the war is hardening his heart. And it's a very powerful scene because, again, another young man has to die because of him. And this sequence is followed up by another in which Lawrence is once again letting his own legend fuel his ego and go too much to his head. So Lawrence is contemplating attacking Dira. And Lawrence wants to go and lead the Arab revolt. And basically, he thinks that he is a prophet, and the men in his company think he's a prophet as well. Lawrence even commits further blasphemy in this scene by asking, "Who will walk on water with me?" which is a direct comparison to Jesus Christ. So here, Lawrence is comparing himself to Jesus, and he is again letting his own legend go to his head. And ultimately, what happens is that he is caught when he goes to Dira because Lawrence acts like a complete and utter fool. He doesn't even try to blend in. He thinks he's invincible. And ultimately, what happens is he's detained, beaten, and it is even inferred that he may have been raped. And as a result of all this, it leads to more change for Lawrence. Now, as a result of these events, Lawrence wants to leave. He even says, "I have come to the end of myself." And an interesting thing that he says, which I really like, is that he says, "A man cannot want what he wants." And the sad thing is that when he returns among the British, that he cannot even fit back in with them. He couldn't go back even if he wanted to. And that is the sad thing because the change has already occurred within him. He's not the same person anymore as he was when the film opened up and we saw that eccentric poet. He is a warrior now. Now, after this, we see Prince Faisal upset with the British due to the treaty between France and England to share the remnants of the Turkish Empire. So, as a result of this, Prince Faisal is upset. He knows that the British were up to no good the entire time, and he even believes Lawrence knew the entire time, even though he didn't. Because once again, Lawrence is kind of naive. Lawrence considers himself to be an Arab almost. So he had no knowledge of this treaty between France and England to share the Turkish Empire. Now, at this point in the story, Lawrence wants nothing to do with the war. He wants nothing to do with the desert. He just wants to be ordinary. Lawrence refuses to be part of the Damascus attack, and he feels like he is going insane. He says he feels like he is going mad. And here again, we have it illustrated to us. Lawrence struggling with the desire to be ordinary. He's struggling with the legend. He no longer wants to be the legend, the Lawrence of Arabia legend. He wants nothing to do with it. Instead, he wants to be ordinary. He wants to go back to an ordinary life, but he can't. And there is some great symbolism here as he goes on a tangent with his superiors, and you can see the blood from the lashes that he received when he was captured start to bleed through his clothes, and you can see the blood on his back as he pleads with his superiors to let him live an ordinary life, for him to be basically relieved of his duties, to not have to go to Damascus and lead the attack. And as he's trying to plead with his superiors to go back to an ordinary life, it's almost like the true self, the true Lawrence, bleeds through his clothes, signifying the truth, which is that he's a warrior and he can't hide it. So that's what the blood does. In my opinion, the blood symbolizes the man underneath the clothes, the man that's trying to hide. As he's trying to plead with his superiors to not let him go to Damascus, the truth is there that he's a warrior. There are his scars. He cannot hide his scars no longer. They're bleeding through the clothes. He is a warrior. He's a changed man. No matter how much he wants to go back to living that ordinary life, he can't. Because ultimately, he is good at what he does, which is being that leader, which is being Lawrence of Arabia. And Lawrence quickly turns, like he quickly goes from wanting to be an ordinary man back to not wanting to be an ordinary man. And his change is visible to those around him. Even his photographer says Lawrence has changed. They can see the duality in Lawrence. And when Lawrence and his men stage another attack on the Turks, and his men see the defeated Turks, Lawrence struggles with his bloodlust, and he goes from being known for mercy to declaring no prisoners. And it's almost like him exacting revenge for the death of his servant who accidentally blew himself up with the detonator. So he goes from being known for being merciful to openly declaring no prisoners. And Ali is horrified by Lawrence's transformation. He sees that he is no longer a man of mercy. And when Lawrence holds up the dagger to look at his reflection, he cannot even recognize himself. He is covered in blood. So compare that with when he first looked at himself, when he was wearing the Hadith clothes, and how he was dancing around and he was being the romantic, being the eccentric romantic, and looking at him now and seeing him as the blood-stained, hardened warrior. It is a real powerful transformation. And it's really sad to see Lawrence through the eyes of Ali, because you can tell that Ali really loves this man. And I love how he echoes that original sentiment when they first met, in which Lawrence said to him, as long as the Arabs fight among one another, they will be a silly people, a barbarous people. And as Ali looks at Lawrence, he says, the Arabs are barbarous. Who but they? Who but they? Totally illuminating the contradiction in Lawrence. The hypocrisy. Now that the Turks are defeated, the Arabs tried to create an Arab National Council in Damascus with all the tribes, but all they do is end up arguing, and it is a political disaster. And Lawrence declares that he never wants to see the desert ever again. However, it is brought to his attention the negligence and basically the inhumane conditions that are present at a hospital for prisoners of war. And these prisoners of war are obviously the Turks. And when Lawrence arrives there, the conditions are horrific. There are hundreds and hundreds of Turks who are prisoners of war, who are wounded, who have no one to attend to their wounds, and they are suffering. And this scene leads to another moment of irony where the man at the beginning of the film who stood up to Lawrence's photographer for saying that he was a shameless exhibitionist and that he was a great man and he had the honor to shake his hand, that very same man arrives at the scene and sees Lawrence and asks him, "Are you responsible for this?" And Lawrence just laughs hysterically like a madman and he slaps him across the face. And this scene is so ironic and it just illustrates how legends can warp people's perceptions because later on, which is in the beginning of the film, this man thinks Lawrence is a great man. He has no idea that the person that he slapped, the person that he held accountable for the negligence for the Turkish prisoners of war was Lawrence. I love that scene. It is very powerful because, again, it illustrates how the power of legend can warp people's perceptions. Now, ultimately, what happens between the British and the Arabs is that Britain strikes a deal with Prince Faisal. And ultimately, what happens is that the Arabs will be able to occupy where the Turkish Empire was, but it's going to be officially part of Britain. Now, the film ends with Lawrence being taken away. He's sitting in the passenger seat, being driven away, and he passes by some Arabs riding horses, and he kind of gets excited and he stands up and he realizes that the war is over in my mind. That's what I think happens. And then he kind of settles down, and that's how the film ends. It just ends with that last impulse that Lawrence had. As he drives by these men, he just gets this shot of energy in him, and he just stands up almost like he wants to lead a charge, or he wants to see what's going on with these men, or he wants to ride with them. He just gets excited and he stands up on impulse, and then it kind of subsides as he realizes that it's all over. The war is over. And then the film ends like that. But for me, I immediately think back to the opening of the film in which Lawrence has the motorcycle accident. And as I said, in my opinion, the reason why he was driving so recklessly and so fast and speeding was because he was trying to replicate the thrills of fighting in the desert, of leading the charge of battle as Lawrence of Arabia. So I thought that was a fitting end to the film because it shows that even though Lawrence is going back to a quote unquote ordinary life, that it is still in him. There's still something inside him that has changed. That thrill, that thirst for adventure, it's still in him. And I believe that's what that last scene was trying to convey to the viewer. And this ends my thesis and analysis of Lawrence of Arabia. And I want to thank you guys for listening and viewing this video. I appreciate each and every one of you. I love this film. It is my favorite film of all time. I love the themes of duality, of irony, of coincidence versus destiny, of fate versus free will. I just love it. I think the film is a powerful message. I feel like it's a powerful story. And I love the fact that the answers are not given. There are no answers. There is no answer whether it was fate or destiny, whether it was written or whether it wasn't written. Because if there was an answer, if that was provided in the film, it would not be good. Because that's not how real life is. Real life is ambiguous, it leaves you asking questions. It's a matter of conviction, it's a matter of faith, it's a matter of belief or doubt. And I love that that's how the film leaves it. It leaves all the questions unanswered. I thought it was brilliant because, in that way, it absolutely resonates with the viewer because that's how real life is. We will never know with absolute certainty whether there is a destiny or whether everything is free will. Is there a God? Is there not? These are the questions that man will ask as long as he has air in his lungs. And I think this is a brilliant way to show that through this film. Thank you guys again for viewing the video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care and one love.